صباح الخير طلال.
صباح النور.
كيفك؟
الحمد لله.
We are very delighted to be in your presence here in New York. I am joined by my long-term best friend Sinan Antoon, who will be assisting me in trying to navigate this conversation. We actually are holding this as part of the long-form program podcast, and Mu'in Rabbani is my co-host, and Sinan Antoon is a guest host today, who will actually appear with us in the future in other conversations, I hope. We are here, Talal, to address a number of issues related both to your work, but mainly to how you see the current moment, whether it is what has been happening in Gaza and the genocide that we have been witnessing day in and day out, as well as other implications on terms and concepts and words and terminology that has been used for the past decades that you have written about, and that has interested me quite a bit. The first thing I would like to ask you is about the current moment, which is a part of the thread of this entire project that we are putting together. The current moment locally here in the United States or globally, and certainly the Middle East. How do you see it? And you can select any dimension to address. Is it a formative moment, a beginning of a new era perhaps, or is it business as usual? In other words, after this moment subsides in one form or another, are we going to go back to business as usual in various regards?
Yeah, no, this is of course an obvious question that has occupied most of us. And I think perhaps I should begin by making a distinction that I do increasingly feel should be made, at least for me, between pessimism, which is my general feeling, and I'll elaborate on that in a minute, and hope. Pessimism, in my view, and even optimism are both judgments based on some kind of evidence, so that one can even talk about the prospects of good weather or bad weather in terms of some notion of how the past builds up to make one calculate certain probabilities, if you want to be mathematical about it, but have some evidence of some kind about the past. In my view, the present, and I mean by the present not only just in Gaza, which is the culmination of certain things, but more generally, and I'll come to that in a minute as to what I mean by the present. It is so, the past for us, as it increasingly reveals itself, but has not completely, has been so unprecedented that I think it's very difficult to arrive at some precise judgment about the future. And I want to say something more about the past, because in a sense, what has interested me in something that I'm trying to write over the last 10 years, not for the last year, not since October, I haven't been able to do anything on it, but has been precisely the origin of some fundamental aspects of what I see as modernity and our modern civilization. But since we don't have any, and I think we are moving in a direction which is not very happy, but again, this is just a general feeling. But together with that, there is another sense of what I would call hope, which is not based so much on evidence, but something that one looks forward to. Hope is something one hopes for, even if the evidence is not there. And that I still have, because I feel, and I make a rather crude, quick statement about the present. I think that we are moving, whether it's going to be short term or longer term or not, towards something that I see as as an implosion of our present civilization, which is characterized for me, and I've been working on that, as I say, for many years now, except for the last year and a half. For me, the central aspects of that are, on the one hand, the growth and formation and expansion of the nation state, and on the other hand, of global capitalism. And they're both very closely connected with each other. And I think we are coming to a crisis for both of them, political, economic, as well as technological, especially, various aspects of technology which have to do with artificial intelligence and so on and so forth, and also changes in weather, which affect the way in which people may or may not move from one part of the world to another. And the fact that there isn't any proper response to this, many people complain about it. I have friends who are very much involved in climate activism. It's not climate warmth or whatever. It's not growing warmth of the climate, but increasing climate instability, which I think will happen more and more. And what is deeply disturbing to me is not so much that we can identify where and how these things are caused, but the fact that we can't do anything about it. And I increasingly am of the opinion that it's not even so much a matter of identifying, as it were, the wicked source of this, like, corporations, oil corporations and so on. If we want to identify wickedness, yes, we can. But increasingly that we have created unwillingly, or rather unknowingly, a form of life which makes things very difficult to disentangle. A form of life in which we are constantly entangled in certain things which make other, even temporary solutions of problems difficult, if not impossible. It's a bit like, to put it crudely, like a log jam in a river, or even perhaps something like a traffic jam and so on, where you can't move one way because somebody else is moving another. And I always think of, and I remind my friends who are trying, and I don't want to remind them too often because I think what they are doing is very important, and that is working for some kind of response to increasing climate change, because who knows, Allahu Ya'lam, as we say, whether this will be successful or not, but I think not. But I won't say this because it's stupid to say it, and at the same time feel hope. And that is that it's really the way in which we are all now living. If tomorrow all the petrol companies and all the states which were involved in bringing oil and gas out from the earth stopped, or were made to stop, what would be the result? I think the result would be there would be an enormous amount of pushback from ordinary people who would say, where are we going to get heat in the winter and coolth in the summer? Where are we going to get energy for various things? Where are we going to get the plastics which everything is made of, including our clothes? Where are we going to get all these things, which in fact has become so basic to the way in which we live? So it's not just that there are bad, wicked little oil companies and so on. It is the way we live. And I don't think anybody wanted that in the past, but this is what interests me, how we have come to. So we didn't know 2-3 centuries ago, I say we, anyway, perhaps what we might mean. But we didn't know how this would end up and where we would be. And there are many things. I've been, attacked both by Habermas and by his pupils and so on for being anti-modernity and so on. Yeah, in some ways, but not in other. I don't say everything about modernity is bad. On the contrary, I enjoy so many things which are possible now, which were not possible. Beautiful things, beautiful movies, beautiful paintings, music, beautiful technology, even fine, cures for certain illnesses and so on, which we didn't have. All these things are real, but fundamentally, I think we are moving, despite ourselves, in the wrong direction. And I see it ultimately, and this is also wound up with what is also my hope, with a kind of implosion. Whether it's going to be today or tomorrow, or no, I don't think it'll be today. But anyway, it'll be after I'm dead, but almost certainly. But when that happens, I'm just hoping that we can rebuild a more humane and human form of life, which is neither really capitalist and which is neither really based on the nation state, because we now have a system everybody has to have or does have a nation state. So that's part of my answer, and that is that I don't see this as in the long term as business as usual. I do see it nevertheless as likely that we will really destroy ourselves. Not only is there climate change, these are things that have been talked about again and again. There's also the kind of technology that has produced nuclear weapons. And there are there are a number of very respectable commentators who have pointed out the reality of and the probability of a third world war, which is nuclear this time. And then, Allahu Alam, as they say, what happens. I discovered a paper which is, Irfan, I hope you don't mind, because I get disturbed with you sitting in the back there.
Oh.
Would you mind sitting somewhere else? Never mind, ma'alesh. It's because I see him there looking straight at me. So, never mind. There is a very interesting book, an article which I discovered a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, by John von Neumann. Mean anything to you? You know him.
Yeah.
He was, of course, part of the Manhattan Project, right? He's a mathematician. And he wrote a paper which, in fact, was published the very year I came to London, 1950. And that was entitled something like, almost exactly, Can We Survive Our Technology? Already in 1950, he raises that question. So, there's another person whom I'm a great admirer of, called, what's his first name again? Stefan or something? I forget. Weizenbaum. Do you know him too? He was, again, a mathematician and so on. And he was at MIT as a professor for a long time. He's dead now. He died in the first decade of the 21st century. And he was the inventor of ChatGPT. And he wrote a book, something called Human Reason from Reasoning to Calculation or something like that. And he was very pessimistic about the consequences of AI. This is already, nearly 20 years ago, not quite, but 15 years ago. He went back. He came as a boy. His family came as refugees from Germany. And then after he retired, he went back to Germany. He said, I'd rather live there than in America. I can understand that. Anyway, he's not alive any longer. But so there are many people who have foreseen this and foreseen the uncontrolled, because he argued, and so did von Neumann, that the speed at which our technology is moving, especially the artificial intelligence and so on, is faster than human intention can intervene. So that, not only with robots and so forth, there have been science fiction things as well on this and so forth. But I think that there is a recognition that things are getting out of control. And that feeds into my own sense of not being able, and of course the economy, the capitalist economy, which is being talked about more and more now. There's going to be a crisis also, first beginning with the American dollar as the world currency, and so on, but the consequences are not just formal. They're going to have an enormous impact on ordinary people and what they can do, how they can live, whether they can live with some dignity or with some possibility of looking to a real future or not. And if so, where will they go? I'm sure, for example, that when people move from the third world towards Europe, which will be, of course, the most protected and so on, we will have not just prevention, they will be bombed. I'm convinced of it. Not just prevented from coming into Europe, but they will be physically bombed to prevent them from coming, because it will not be possible when millions start coming, and not just as a result of climate change and things like that. So this is a pessimistic view, but it seems to me the result will be some kind of an implosion. And if that happens, I have hope that out of that we will remember the things that we made, which were in a direction which we couldn't predict and so forth, and which led to disaster, human disaster, and that out of that something more worthwhile can come. I don't think all human beings will disappear. I think a lot of species are disappearing, as we all know, which should be a matter of great shame to us, but it doesn't seem to worry too many people. So that's one answer. And I'm trying to think about how we started, as it were, several centuries ago, end of the 17th century, beginning of the 18th, and so on, in developing both capitalism, industrial capitalism, and also of the nation state, with the notion of sovereignty and so on, and how both of them, which depend on each other, really led to the multiplying crises that we have at the moment. Even the thing that we have with regard to we will come to that in a moment, I'm sure, but with Gaza and so on, the importance of weapons. I mean, there is the United States the government is dependent very heavily on the weapons industry, which is part of what flourishes. It's the one that flourishes most from any other industry here in this country. And so that's the one that's supplying it with aims to expand its neo-imperial reach. But it won't, of course, be able to continue indefinitely, in my view. But we'll come to that later on. But it's this thing that I'm looking at. I was just thinking about, is it something where things will go back to normal, or is it something that will lead to a reformation? I think neither is directly answerable, but I hope that one of them will lead to, the collapse will lead to something more positive. But human beings are stupid, So this is, it's difficult to say whether this will happen.
That's
what I'm still working on.
That's quite a bit to process.
Okay.
Thank you. Shukran.
I think in a way you already began answering partly the next question, which is about how in your work you've always emphasized the intersection and interaction between categories of religion, politics, culture, and violence, broadly speaking. So how does your work inform what we are witnessing now, including the genocide in Gaza, and how might the events of the past 16 months locally and globally, compel you to reflect on your own work, generally speaking?
It's, I mean, my own life has been very closely connected with the way in which I think. It's not only my work,
Of course.
but my work is connected with my life, and because I increasingly, one of the philosophers that has been most influential in my thinking is Wittgenstein, and his notion of forms of life, and the way in which language and thought, even therefore through language, is connected with forms of life. That is to say, which I'm trying to develop in my own direction for my own purposes.
I have to. There was a bit of a glitch, and you might have to repeat the answer. Is that possible?
Yes. What now? From the beginning? Min al-bidayah?
Just it's
This question
30
here.
seconds. No, just the past 30 seconds. Do you want to pose the question? Do you mind?
Well,
I was going to ask a follow-up question on if you could
If-
elaborate more,
yes.
or where you
Hang on.
derive the hope. Is that okay?
yeah.
Yeah, but let me make sure.
I'll ask this. Okay. I can repeat the question.
Okay, so what we will do is that after I said thank you, you will pick up and we'll edit that out, and then you ask the second question. You know what I mean? After you do the follow up on the first
Okay.
question.
This is a good thing. The follow-up on hope.
Yes, because I loved what was said, what Talal said, and this is a major theme. So feel free. So I want to do the clap.
Yalla.
So thank you so much. I just wanted a follow-up question. If you could elaborate a little bit about hope. You spoke of hope amidst all of this pessimism. But where are the resources of hope, in a way, to quote Raymond Williams? How, for our audiences or people listening, how at this moment would younger generations who are desirous of change and of building a different type of future, where do they get the resources of hope?
Well, in the first place, I think that for me, as I've said earlier on, hope is not so much a judgment based on evidence, but an attitude about the future. And that attitude has been built up for me in my whole life. In fact, I was, even when I moved, although, as you know, I was born in Medina, but I was only a year and a half old when my parents went to British India. I call it always British India, by the way, which is quite distinct from India. Before there was this partition, which I think was a great mistake anyway, but that's another story. And that has made me this move from, because I only knew Pakistan as Pakistan for 2 years. I arrived, when I was 18 in 1950, full of expectation that this is a wonderful society, which is obviously more tolerant, more open, more rational, more welcoming than the one that I had found in Pakistan at the time, although I was a boy then. And it was slowly, so I began to learn another form of life, full of hope of some kind, that this would be a model of something. And it was at that time, by the way, although I'm very critical of the nation state, given that the nation state, this is now a fait accompli, so to speak, the whole world is a system of nation states. I prefer certain nation states to others. I prefer the one that I first encountered in England, in Britain, which was where there was a national health service. It was a welfare state. It was a state which had national health system. It was a state that was very much concerned about the working classes, the poor, and so on. So that was, for me, the start of, and of course the fact that it was being whittled from underneath, eaten up from within, until its final demise under Thatcher, meant that my hope had to be constantly readjusted. And that was also when I really discovered Marxism, and then joined this collective that was the editorial board of Economy and Society, which was very interested in contemporary Marxist thought, because I saw it as being an internal critique of the way in which Western society was itself, or was developing, and so on. But even that gradually began to lose its force and its power, not because of what many right-wing people said at the time, that all our universities are dominated by Marxists. I could count them almost on two hands, the number of actual Marxists there were. But this paranoia is something that comes and goes. And we have that again now, but this time more seriously, I think, here and in England too, and in America. So I have wanted always, I think, from that time, to hope for a form of life that is more open, more just, more caring. We've lost the sense of caring also, and I'll come back to that when we talk about people nowadays talking about universities here, and they constantly talk, the ones who are controlling and twisting universities in a repressive direction, but they keep talking about university, the community, but they don't know what community means. They are confusing community with a hierarchical governmentality. And it's not a community that they have in mind at all, because they bring in notions and rules and penalties and so forth on everybody within it. That's not a community.
If I may, Talal, in your work and some of your lectures, you made a distinction between, or addressed these three terms: sympathy, empathy, and caring. I would love to hear, in that context, something about those different words.
Well, I mean, sympathy simply doesn't imply necessarily understanding the full experience that somebody who is suffering undergoes, whereas empathy is in fact more an entering into the way they themselves are feeling and experiencing, which is the basis of, which is one, I think, the most important basis of the way in which one can develop a certain caring attitude. Now, here, this is it. But caring may be a caring for prisoners, caring for, your own family only, caring for just your own people. This is the trouble with nation states, in my view, and that is that it has a notion of one let of people. Then you've got to have not only boundaries which are physical, but also you have to have a notion of those who don't belong. Without that, the nation state is not possible. And while it's impossible to, as it were, to be connected with, at the same time, to everybody, or even be involved in caring for everybody at the same time, it seems to me that any fixed notion that you belong only to one group of people, and one group of people only, is something that, it seems to me, has dangerous implications. And one can and should. I've talked, I think, in my sorry, I have to go all over the place here. But in that article about, I quote, what's his name, Freud, whom I'm becoming again increasingly interested in, because I think one of the things we have to understand is the ways in which one learns to deceive oneself. And I think that that's very important. And I think that he shows us this, or at least he's very much concerned with this, let me say. But I'm not sure that his methods are entirely appropriate to, groups of people and entire societies, which is what people like what's his name, Adorno and Marcuse and so on were concerned to use psychoanalysis to explain this. Now I'm going on to the other point about liberalism having certain potentialities within itself to explain how Nazism arose. And I'm not entirely persuaded by that, except that I think the notion of liberalism as being much more fragile than people have usually thought of, and much more contradictory than people have usually thought of, and therefore have the potentialities for moving in all sorts of directions. And that's what I mean. But I want to go back to Freud again, and that is, he wrote a very well-known paper in 1917, I think it was, on war and death and so on. You know that one, in which he says, how is it that we that the state with which everybody is supposed to project themselves, identify themselves, is also doing things in this war. All the things that people are normally taught, if they are to be moral people, they should not do. The state lies, it kills, it deceives, and so on and so forth. And yet, in other words, it's behaving like as you should not behave as ordinary individuals. And yet, as individuals, we are identifying with the state. And I think, but what he didn't, I think, go on adequately to say, because to some extent he also famously says in a translation, I'm going all over the place now, I'm aware, but still, a translation of Totem and Taboo, which we always used to, as anthropologists, read and so on when we were undergraduates. He was a translation into Hebrew, which is well worth reading if you haven't read it. And he says, that first of all, he likes it very much, and he's honored to have it translated in a language that he himself has never learnt and has is the language of his religion and so on, but which he has a religion which he doesn't belong to. Indeed, no religion does he belong to, and so on. So these are things that, and he has no sympathy with the idea of Zionism. Oh, he doesn't say Zion, but he says the establishment of a Jewish state. Nevertheless, he says, and this is something that intrigues me, because these are questions we'll come back to later on. He says, I still feel. People will say, how come you feel? He says, I still feel a Jew. And then he says, people might say, how come you reject all these other things that you still feel a Jew? What is it that makes you feel? He says, can't give you a proper answer now, but I'm sure that science will eventually one day find an answer to it. This is another one of these things about modernity, by the way. In other words, what the distinction that even Wittgenstein used to make between science, since he was himself both a scientist and a mathematician, and what he called scientism, which is an ideology, which he was strongly critical of. And I agree and find that very, very persuasive. That as an ideology, one of the things that, speaking about Freud, that it persuades you is that we know eventually we will be able to find an answer. This is ghurur of a kind that is, or hubris of a kind that is really unmeasurable. This idea that we can always find an answer to these questions. And I think, but the thing that interests me about this remark of Freud is this notion of identity. He's concerned with identity. And I'm concerned more with the way in which one can or can't connect with other people. What does it mean to say you are a Jew? I was once, about a year ago or so, going with somebody an American husband of, I don't know, you may know him, Larry, who is the husband of Ann Stoler. And he suddenly said to me about that. Did your father? Did he feel himself to be a Jew? I said, I don't know what that means. I mean, he never hid the fact that he was, in fact, born a Jew, but he felt that he had converted to Islam and he was a Muslim. I don't know. I never encountered that question from him. It seemed to me a very odd question. That is the notion that somehow feeling is the ultimate thing, and you can make that feeling the basis of your identification with a nation state. You feel you belong to, you're an American. You feel you belong to, you're an Israeli or it has a Jewish state or something like that. Instead of which, it seems to me, I mean, I'm very suspicious of feelings which are not concerned with caring, as you know from what I've written and so on. As the basis of some kind of legal, quasi-legal rules. I think that it's a great mistake and a great danger to use feelings as the basis of rules of that kind. But anyway, the point is that I've always learned to think, coming back to the question that you asked, I've always learned to think and hope for a more inclusive. It's not as if I love the whole world all the time, of course not. But it's possible to link with other people, other religions, other ethnicities, other, if one may even use that usefully, other races or whatever it might be, other classes, and so on. Not just as a matter of I must do that, but simply as you learn to become friends with them and learn to value the kind of life they have, which is no less valuable than the life you have. So that's something that I think is also missed by Freud himself in his writings, as far as I know. But I'm just beginning to reread them now because of the notion of self-deception. Sorry. Yeah. Next time you could just point it, and I will do it myself. You don't have to get up. I mean, I'm against, this is one of the things that I'm deeply suspicious of, and that is a nation state which is, by definition, exclusive. And that's what it seems to me is certainly also very much missing in our modern nation state, capitalist world. And one has to somehow try and think one's way through there and think of how and why one can be also hopeful. One knows that one is not at the moment in a position to have this, because the ways of life are such that it makes it difficult to think in this way. And I can't always think in this way.
Yeah.
I do feel more strongly about certain peoples and less strongly about others, and not at all about others. I don't identify. I've lived for 40 years, as I keep pointing out to my friends, in England from the age of 18 to 58 when we came, my wife and I, to America. But I've never thought of myself as English or identified myself with the English state. It's not because I reject them. I just have, there are lots of things I like. I love about English life and English culture and so on. I know more about their history, but it never occurs to me that these things require you to identify yourself with the state, and therefore of a nation. But that's just the way in which I grew up and happened to grow up in one part of the world, born one place. My mother, Allah yarhamha, I don't know whether I ever told you this, but she used to say to me when she was in the hospital dying, يعني أنت لازم أنت تجي هذا بلدك. أنا وأمي يعني طبعا نحن بنحاول هذه المرة، لذلك أنا يعني زوجتي وأنا كمان جايين إلى السعودية ونجرب إن شاء الله ونسكن هنا. كله كذب طبعا. But my mother was so relieved to hear this. But it's not. I mean, I have nothing against. On the contrary, I have very good friends. My cousin and so on are still there. But I don't think of myself as a Saudi either. It's to me a strange country. I was only born there, and my mother's death time when I was there a year and a half was the longest I've ever spent. I mean, it's not, and I don't like the way the West talks about Saudi Arabia as a whole and Saudis and so on. I don't like it. I don't like the way they talk about Egyptians either, or about Indians even, and I mean Indians now, not just Pakistanis. But this is all part of the European sense of their own privilege and their power. But there we are. I'm sorry, it's not answering your question. Okay. Oh, okay.
In a way, I mean, you started answering this question in a way, but it's about how in your work, you emphasize the intersection between these categories of religion, politics, culture, and violence. How do you reflect on your work, and how does it inform what we're witnessing in terms of the genocide and all of the events of the past 16 months, whether in this country or globally, generally speaking?
How does it? Well, I mean, I've written about this, of course, elsewhere in things you may have looked at the thing on portraits and so on, that when I was 15, I was 15 years old and I lost my faith and I was crying, and when my father went into, that story, he called me into his office and so on. He kept saying, "Don't cry." And I said, I'm sorry, but And he said, "Never mind, you will find your way." And he sent me to a non-Muslim country, which was an enormous, I think I'm grateful to him, enormously grateful to him. And, he chose architecture for me eventually. Because I did a year and a half in a college, chemistry and physics and so on, to become a doctor, but I decided it was not for me. And then he said, "I'm going to choose for you," and said, architecture. And so we went, he sent me to England, and I was so delighted to go there, and I could breathe, I thought, but it was all what to say. It was, anyway, it was a way of slowly keeping a sense of hope all the time, is what roughly, because it was hope that you asked me about, that it could be open, and it could be one in which people, not in the sense of everybody, of course I'm not capable of, loving everybody or being friends with everybody in the world, this is stupid, but the potentiality of anybody. Why should one exclude people from certain categories as being possible deep friends? And I have friends of, I mean, although I came from Pakistan, it was the first passport I had was Saudi, of course, because the British, I don't know whether you know the story about the fact that at that time there was no naturalization law in Pakistan. So a friend of my father's who was a Saudi ambassador said, "Well, we can give him a Saudi passport since he was born in Medina, only born in Medina." And so, okay. But when I went to England, I was a foreigner. I had to register with the police. I had to tell them where I lived every time I moved and so on. I couldn't work, not allowed to work, and so forth. It was a nuisance. And a couple of years later, sorry, I'll come back to that, I think. A couple of years later, when they passed the Pakistan thing, 2 years later, I was entitled to a Pakistani because my father became one and I became as a consequence of that. And I went to the British Home Office, and did I not tell you this story? I must tell you, because I don't think I've written about it. And I had to return my Saudi passport because Saudi Arabia didn't accept both dual nationality. And I had now a Pakistani passport. Commonwealth it was, you see. And I went there and filled in forms and so on. And I gave him the passport. And the English person in the Home Office, said to me, "Welcome, you are now one of us." And people don't believe this to me. And I say, yes, we're talking about the end of 52, before all the enormous, they came mostly after 52, the people, the colored people, most of them were from, from the West Indies or from India and so on, came afterwards. So you would never say a thing like that. It amuses them now, of course. But that's really, truly what he said to me. Welcome, you're now one of us. In other words, you're a member of the Commonwealth. But when there were so many Pakis, no, then it was too much, of course. So, But the thing is that one always had hope. And as I say, the wonderful thing about hope is you don't have to have evidence. So, this is the difference. I keep pointing out to friends that hope is different from pessimism. I mean, if I look just at the facts, I'm very pessimistic. But nevertheless, I have hope, which is an attitude rather than a judgment. And an attitude, one has kept from the beginning, and my parents have contributed to that, and living in different places has contributed to that. So on, that's all. I'm not sure whether I've answered all the questions you asked me, but you can ask again what I've left out.
This reminds me of, I'm biased when it comes to Arabic poetry. ما أضيق العيش لو لا فسحة الأمل.
Ah, yes, quite.
Life would be so unbearable without some hope. No, but just basically just about how you reflect on your work in these past 16 months and all of this.
Oh, yes. Well, I mean, as I say, I have not been able to work on my main manuscript, which is about 85 pages long now already. I have another epilogue in which I was looking at specifically, because that's one part of the book itself, but it elaborated on, as it were, the Islamic conception of ethics, and all specifically, it's an attempt to reread the Quran from that point of view of ikhlaq and so on, and also the fact that I've been rather struck by the fact that the very term in English of character has really changed drastically over the last few centuries. We now talk about character as, he's a funny character or things like. Whereas character in the great novelists, Jane Eyre and people like that, had to do with ikhlaq, had to do with ethics, had to do with the way in which a person had that potentiality. A human being has the potentiality of doing good or doing not good. And of course, you develop to the point where it becomes almost habitual. It's not rules. Conscience, as Elizabeth Anscombe, who's one of Wittgenstein's famous pupils and was his translator and so on also. He wrote in German and was also translated into English. His books are. But as she said, we all know that people who claim people who do the most dreadful things claim that it is their conscience tells them to do it. And she doesn't say this, but you can say, I'm sure that the Israelis are saying that it's their conscience tells them that what they're doing with Gaza is right, because after all they did dreadful things on October 7th. Not, nobody's sufficiently interested in the lies that Israel tells and so on. But anyway, whatever it is, so they persuade themselves that this is so, and they persuade themselves that these people are savages. They are not really human beings, and therefore, they have mistreated human beings. And I have a thing that I want to think about more, which I was trying to reread bits of Freud helped me with, which I consider the most important part of the paper that I wrote, which is about, a victimhood as a feeling of a lack of power. And I give an example of my uncle, that is my father's stepbrother, who I was watching. I told you that, yeah, in the book. You've seen that too, that, you know, who we were watching 67 things on television and so on. And these Egyptian soldiers, defeated soldiers, were being pushed by these young Israeli soldiers in their tanks. And he suddenly said, "Ah, we are the Cossacks now." That is, these young people had power. And, you know, and he was actually not a Zionist. He didn't believe in a Jewish state. And he was, you know, a very compassionate man, a very nice, decent fellow, dentist he became in England and so on. And I was sort of staggered by that. It took me some time to realize what he was saying. In fact, because they are not, I mean, the Egyptian peasant soldiers, defeated soldiers, were not Cossacks. So it's not, as I say, this notion of victimhood, which I'm very interested in, is not the same as revenge. People keep talking about it's the defense or revenge. I don't think it's that. I think it's something more interesting. And that is this Western modern view of powerlessness. Yourself does not have enough power. And it doesn't matter if it's the people who deprived you of power, but there are the people who, whoever you can, exercise power. That is something which reinforces yourself. And yourself needs that power. So that was something that I'm concerned about. But coming about power, and actually somebody who's very much interested in that, if you're interested in it, is Iris Murdoch, who has written not only wonderful novels, but also was a very interesting philosopher and has written quite a lot on ethics and on the history of ethics. Quite inspiring, I find. Anyway, yes.
Talal, I
We
want
went
to.
all over the place.
No, this is
No, it's
actually
excellent.
the thing we are seeking, a conversation, an open-ended conversation. I would like to get to some of your recent talks and some of the things you've written, and I'm not sure if it's published yet, but you had given me a copy about Israel's onslaught against the Palestinians in Gaza. There are a few questions that I'd like to ask you. One of them is that your work, you know, as we all know, addresses the relationships between colonialism, civilization, and violence, among other matters. Can you share with us a few things? I'm going to ask them all, and you can select what you'd like to address. Can you share with us some your view on, first of all, the context within which this genocide is taking place, or plausible genocide for people who are allergic about using
No,
the
it
word
seems to
without.
be quite straightforward.
Absolutely.
Genocide. Yeah.
Second, you sometimes start by addressing the meaning of the questions reporters love to ask in the West, including, do you condemn Hamas?
Yeah.
If you can tell us, first of all, about the onslaught and your views and how you have approached it, and second, about this question or questions of the sort that mainstream media reporters ask, because you did have something specific, some specific things to say about that, including the preconceived notions that are baked into these questions, whether moral or otherwise.
Well, I mean, all right, let me start there. I mean, one of the things that is quite evident about it, not only the fact that it is saying that one ought to start with the 7th of October, but also it begins by it actually has the assumption that the person who is asking that question, do you condemn Hamas, is himself or herself a moral person. This is one of the most striking things about it. That is, it's the morality. I am concerned about morality, and that's why I want to know whether you are also a moral person like me, and whether if you condemn, then you're okay. If you don't condemn, and it's always seemed to me that the right answer, first of all, is there to refuse to answer it. Neither to say that you condemn them, nor to say that you think that they are okay, as it were. It seems to me that they don't have any right, even a moral right, to ask you that question. And yet that is the question that they ask you. And I think that what also is not sufficiently appreciated, that is what I tried to look at, is that there are certain questions that people have no right to ask you about. And you are not obliged to answer them, whether morally or rationally or whatever. You can, because in fact it forces you into a position both of what is beginning or what is important or what is moral and so on. And this is something that silence is sometimes, as I've said, I think in that, is sometimes an appropriate answer. Silence itself can be meaningful. And it's important for you to be able to say, or to imply that you're not going to answer that question. But as you know, as I said in that article, I am struck by the fact that nobody, none of the Western interrogators or questioners and hosts of particular shows have ever asked the question, do you or don't you condemn the Zionist project? Because it seems to me that it is infinitely worse, however terrible, whatever. I think it was not quite as terrible as Israeli 7th of October, but yeah, there were certain things which were done, I'm sure, which were not as it were justified. But it was not infinitely, and I'm not talking simply about what happened as a response to Gaza, but the whole thing from the beginning, even in the 20s. First of all, the fact that it would have been impossible had it not, the whole project, had it not been for the British mandate. So they had British support from the very beginning, and not just 1917, a statement by, the Balfour Declaration, but other people. I can't remember that. Wingate, is it Wingate? Do I mean Wingate, who helped to establish Jewish military forms? Is it? He was, yes, Colonel Wingate. I think it was Wingate who was there, who helped them. And then, of course, the crushing of the rebellion in the 30s, which was quite a brutal one, which the British did for them. And then, of course, after that, gradually, with the Americans taking over, and Americans becoming the great defenders and suppliers and so on. Well, the English continued, and so did the Germans, who were never properly denazified. But anyway, that was, and on the contrary, they have been one of the earliest, they were the earliest recognizers of Israel as a state, Germany, after the Second World War. And actually it was interesting because, one of the things that I was telling you about my father's stepbrother, who said once to my father, who arrived in London, he said, because my father had his father and his sister had also died in concentration camps and so on. So he said to my father, of course, you are entitled to a compensation from the Austrian government for the deaths of your relatives, because he was a stepbrother. It's not a real. And I was struck by his answer, and he immediately said, "No, never. That's blood money. I will never accept blood money from somebody in order to make their conscience comfortable." And of course, that's, and I was said to him, "Why do you not forgive the German people or anything?" He said, "No, it's nothing to do with that. Something so terrible is something only God can forgive. I can't. This is not something for me to, but I won't do that. I won't allow somebody to say, oh, they have compensated me. and therefore their conscience can be okay. So he didn't want to allow that. And of course, that's what Germany has done from the beginning. It has supplied all sorts of money. I mean, supplied money. It has given enormous amounts of money to the Jewish state, in fact, as a state which represents all, including the dead Jews. Not you don't ask the dead Jews because you can't ask them, but you claim for yourself that you represent them. On what basis? What moral or logical or legal basis do you claim to represent dead people, people who have been killed? But they do, and they are entitled to all the money that comes to them and all the support now from Europe and from, I suppose, America as well. Anyway, I don't know how we got to that point, but it was you know something that has struck me very much, and I have slowly fallen out of love with Europe, if you like, and the West, and because for me, you know, it was wonderful to breathe European air when I first arrived, and as I say, we spent most of my time, my adult life, in England, but and all sorts of becoming a Marxist and not becoming a Marxist and so on has been part of my not only the basis of my work. In fact, it has been in various ways the basis, and Gaza, it seems to me, has been the sort of final and most terrible in my life experience of something which, on the one hand, was so terrible, and which, as I say, must be understood, in my view, not simply as self-defense, certainly not as revenge for seven, no, but of something called the victim's loss of his or her power, and the sense that the victim has lost something which is deeply important, especially for, as it were, Western civilization, and that is, therefore, the need to that is to exercise power. And you exercise it, it doesn't matter who you exercise it to, it's not the same as revenge. We use the term to get equal with somebody, right, for revenge. It's not a question of equality. It's a question of yourself somehow being satisfied that you are no longer lacking something which is fundamental to you, yourself, and that is power. And that seems to me to be part of, as it were, fundamental our society. But
Absolutely, Talal. There are a
I
few
didn't
themes.
answer completely.
No, this is actually, I mean, the whole idea for us is to have a conversation about your thoughts on what's happening. So it's actually good because there will be some overlap. I want to ask you a couple of other questions, and you can return to what you feel you want to return to if you want, if you'd like. My other question has to do with your remarkable book, a shorter book called On Suicide Bombing that you wrote in 2008, which I am a big fan of. And in that book, you addressed a number of topics relating to the word civilization, where it comes from, about culture,
Horror.
and so on and so forth. Can you address specifically in this context the hypocrisy, the paradoxes of using the word and term terrorism amid the slaughter we are witnessing by the Israelis in Gaza, in relation to that book, in relation to questions of terrorism and suicide bombing and this separation between the civilized and the uncivilized, as if civilization has a definite definition, and so on and so forth. Is there can you share with us your take on these terms in relation to your work, whether in this book or in general?
Well, the book, one of the things about my work is Unfortunately, I find that I'm not very happy about looking back at my own work, because I would want to. That's why I never finish anything which I have, like this book that I'm trying to write about, the origin and so forth of how one aspect of modernity to do with different kind of politics, different kinds of of ethics and so forth, and the connection between these two. But I'm still writing on and on and on, always trying to, every time I go back, which I haven't done, as I've said before several times, I want to keep on, as it were, writing and rewriting and cutting out and so forth, because my thoughts keep developing in different directions. But anyway, with regard to that, one of the interesting things which I think I do mention in that article, the recent one that I wrote, which about Gaza, is the way in which the term, I'm relying on somebody who I have footnotes on, who did some work and on the use of the term terrorism, and didn't actually, and he argues that he has gone through quite a lot of material, but it was not very much used by American politicians until relatively recently, of course. And that's not just Israel, but also 9/11. And of course, 9/11 was very closely connected with Israel too. Israel made use of that, made use of it as its own partner in the war against terrorism and so on. So there was a conference, in fact, in Jerusalem first, with Israel, as it were, sponsored by Israel and by the United States, on terrorism, world terrorism, and then another one was it in Washington or anyway, in the States, a few years later, on terrorism. So there was a great interest in the word terrorism and so on. There's also Happy Use. There's another person whom I must say, sort of a bête noire of mine, and that is Michael Walzer, who is such a dishonest man.
Yes, that was in the piece you wrote.
Yes, that's right. That was in the previous. And he talked about why is it always Israel they're saying to? Nobody's saying always to Israel, don't do these things. In fact, nobody of any importance is saying that. But they're saying about why are they not saying it about Hamas, right? And what I remember, what I said was simply that, what could be said about, in other words, about Hamas was, you should lay down your arms, you should surrender, be taken tortured, and perhaps eventually executed. These dreadful people don't do that. They should really do that, and that's not something that Israel itself was supposed to do. But he did bring in something which alerted me to something which I know many people themselves know about, and that is of saying that Hamas doesn't care enough about the suffering of fellow Palestinians. So it's suddenly, what is happening in part is his suggestion, which of course we find reflected in Israeli politics and Israeli policy towards Gaza, is to increase the suffering of the Palestinians until they give up, until even Hamas gives up, or they turn against Hamas, right? That is to say, make them suffer, make ordinary Palestinians suffer so much, even more than they do at the moment, so that they turn against the cause of their suffering, as everybody has been telling them, and that is Hamas, and then force the Hamas to do this. And it occurred to me that this is exactly what, in fact, what we now call terrorists do when they go and even sort of, what are they called? I mean, suicide bombers and so forth. They are aiming at the state. They destroy ordinary civilians, innocent civilians, in order to make the state responsible for doing something, perhaps giving up or perhaps adjusting to such a. So in fact, they are doing exactly what suicide bombers do. That is, they are killing civilians in order to force the state to respond in the way that the suicide bomber wants. So that's what the Israelis, that's what Michael Walzer was saying, the Israelis should do, but they're already doing it. We know that. They don't need Walzer to tell them that.
And that's besides the contradiction that if you think, and if you're saying, if they are saying that Hamas doesn't care about the suffering of its people, why should more suffering change their position?
Well, until they turn against, physically they turn against Hamas. That's the argument, you see.
Yeah. I mean, there's two sides to it.
Yes, exactly. Well, but that's the whole point. Therefore, in fact, they don't recognize that this is exactly what everybody we are told here should condemn suicide bombers for, who come into civil society and start and blow up themselves as well as other people who are innocent, men, women, children, few, half a dozen or something. Whereas Israel is able to do, Israel should do much more and make them absolutely something. I told you I was reading this review in London Review of Books just now, which is about a review of Hamas. I forget the two authors who are, but one aspect of that, of course, is precisely that the expectation is that Hamas should give up as a result of not out of their goodness, of their compassion, but out of their impossibility to function. They're also straightforwardly in the book, as they say, we know about, and that is that the Israelis have themselves used civilians in the what are they called?
Human shields.
As human shields in
the tunnels.
In the tunnels.
Yeah.
They make them go in first to be blown up, and then they don't have to go into. So but nobody notices it. Nobody notices it. Nobody cares about it. But anyway, this is not a complete answer to it.
No. In this regard, since we're talking about
Exactly.
suicide, maybe I'll ask you to. You've written about this recently about Aaron Bushnell and taking his own life, and how the media described him as mentally deranged person. Could you
say something about that?
Yes.
Well, just that it seems to me that the media are mentally deranged. That he is not mentally deranged. He's despairing and he's hoping that somehow his self-immolation, like many of these monks in Thailand, where is it? Well, not in Thailand, in Vietnam. You remember the monks who blew themselves up? That they were concerned really to try and make people ashamed of what, in fact, they were doing. And this is what it seems to me Bushnell is. But what seemed to me obvious from the results of what the comments people made, which didn't surprise me at all, because as I say, I think in that he's aiming himself, hoping that those who run the state will have some response. That the state tells people how to kill other people in a war or in so-called self-defense. Everything is self-defense. Everything is self-defense always, of course, with states. No state says we are doing this just because we love to kill the enemy, but we are doing this for self-defense. Even the Germans used to have Lebensraum. They had to do it because they needed more land, more area. Anyway, so that fact that he was trying to aim, when aiming at the state, poor fellow, he didn't fully take into. It was a desperate measure, obviously, and it was a measure that tried to awaken people's conscience. But there's no such thing, as we know, as I said earlier on. The state does these, or politicians within the state, whether they are Biden or whether they are Trump, or so there's no real difference between them. They're all the same. They are people who are willing to kill or have somebody else kill, and themselves to say, as a state, we have the right to do this. Everything is self-defense, of course. So it becomes part of that. And they didn't see, here's a man who is trying to awaken your conscience, and he's obviously failing in those cases where the people say, how come he's either mentally deranged or he's an extremist, and so on, which is actually not surprising at all. It's typical of what one would expect. So it's, as I say, this is what the modern state does. Power, Machtstaat, as they call it, state, power state.
We would like to address a couple of things, but first, let me close this conversation, this broad conversation, with a question about your the body of work, and what you also mentioned today about liberalism as a body of thought, as whether it's liberal thinkers, authors, and liberal democracy as a system. If you can take us to this particular moment we're in today, what do we continue to discover? And you've written about this before vis-a-vis other events. What do we continue to discover today as the decades unfold about these categories? How have they fared in the past 16 months or so? And have we learned anything new, discovered even more limits, or some sort of have we continued to discover this notion that you addressed in some of your writing, of this unbounded capacity for liberalism to reinvent itself and justify all sorts of destruction uh, based on its attempt to make the world better? And you said only liberalism is able to do that. It's capable of going to the ends of to the limit of what can be called destruction in order, quote unquote, to do something good, to bring about a positive outcome.
Well, that's something. Yeah, that is in a sense also something that I'm thinking about with regard in the book, and thinking it's not just that. Gradually, what I see in liberalism is really something which can easily morph into something which is quite different from what it claims to be. Quite different. So it is a kind of a restructuration that is occurring. In other words, I see liberalism not as a specific type, but as an arena of political action and political justification and political life, where things issue from that into something quite different. Actually, there's something which, again, this is an issue which interests me in this book particularly, about how, even as I said earlier on, the interesting thing about what happened over the centuries was the emergence of something which was not immediately thought of as something that would happen. And I have in my book actually something which is a kind of an epigraph of one particular section, in which I have a famous quote, and some people don't even know it, where somebody says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." They don't know what they're doing. It's not that they are necessarily directly evil, but they don't know what the hell they're doing. In this case, of course, it has to do specifically with Jesus and the fact that they don't know that they are crucifying Christ and so on. And it's part of the whole plan of as it were, of the in Christianity, of the sacrifice of Christ and so on. But this is the important point. The The important point is that people are doing something and they don't know what they're doing. And it's not just morally whether it's good or bad, but what the consequences also of them are going to be.
Who are the people when you say people?
Well, in this case, I mean, it was, well, as Jesus says this, he talks about the people who are responsible for both the Romans and the Jews, who were responsible for the crucifixion. They don't know what they're doing.
But in the current moment.
Oh well, in the current moment, it's quite clear. It's first of all, it's Israel itself, and there's been this argument as to whether Israel is simply an outpost of America or America is an outpost of Israel. I think that the two are so closely connected. It's not possible to say that they are two totally separate. For the moment, they are in fact totally bound together. And what Israel does is what America does, and what America does is what Israel is able to do, and so on. So there's no difference here. I don't see that there should be a quarrel here at all. They are both tied to each other in ways that they don't even always recognize. They do very often, quite explicitly, but in other ways they don't. When they are saying, we have tried to say to them and so on, sometimes they are lying, they're straightforwardly lying when they say they've tried to suggest don't go to Rafah and all that sort of thing. That's the red line. And of course, they know very well it's not the red line. But sometimes they deceive themselves into thinking, yes, they've told them what is important, and they will look into when these people in the car, these the not Red Cross people, but whoever they were, these
World Kitchen.
World Kitchen. That's it. Thank you. Who were murdered, and who were in fact asked. They were told. The Israelis were told already who were they did, and the Americans think, well, no, they will find out what kind of mistake was made, and I'm sure they will do that.
Until preferences diverge a bit, which we have seen with Trump, when he wanted an immediate halt for his own reasons, not for humanitarian reasons. Until preferences diverge, it seems that the U.S., as opposed to Israel, can have the upper hand in making.
Of course, it has always had the upper hand. I mean the fact that stupid old Trump was able to do what he was able to do, even though Netanyahu was not very happy with it, he had to go along with it, and they've had, especially as it's a meaningless agreement, really. I mean, the fact that they can break it any time they want, and it would still be part of that agreement. I mean, that seems to me to be grotesque. But the people keep talking about it as though it was a wonderful thing, when they still have been, of course, fighting. They have been bombing still after the agreement of the so-called agreement of the ceasefire. They have been bombing. Nobody, the media don't make anything of it. It's understood that the Israelis
with southern Lebanon, of course.
Yeah,
Violating the every day.
yeah, absolutely. They continue with them every day. Yes. So I don't know. I don't know where a calculation of doing a little bit of harm for much good comes in, or where no, they are perfectly okay, and that kind of thought comes in, where self-deception at the level of what is actually being done, or at the level of you can explain what is done in terms of some consequence which might have been worse had it not been allowed to be done.
Will liberalism emerge unscathed out of this context?
What a question you ask.
Yes, I know. That's why I said it with purpose, because we always critique liberalism and how people believe in something that actually is sometimes divorced from reality. Has what happened put a dent in that sort of unquestioned?
This is what fascinates me about both about modern politics and about modern ethics. This is something new, even in Europe. That is to say, a notion that you can do. Famously, Weber said this, as you very well know, in his in Politics as a Vocation, where he says that anybody who thinks that only good can come from good good action and bad evil from an evil action is politically immature, right? And I think that this is a conception. This is a new conception. It wasn't there before. There was a sense that you could do all sorts of awful things because you felt you had the right to in relation to inferior people, and that they had no right. But this notion that you could somehow square morality with whatever political action you take, including that of the destruction of whole peoples, as is happening in Gaza, is relatively new. Although they did that in other places like Namibia and so on, as you know. And they've done that in other places. But what kind of justification they took on that occasion is I don't know enough about. But certainly even in famines and so on in India, which they were responsible for, the British was responsible for, they did, because we had to do this in order to maintain a certain kind of order and so on. And unfortunately, there was a consequence of this sort of thing. So, self-deception again of some kind. All this is, in my view, and I'm still, not 100% fixed in this, but I'm trying to do research on it and read it on it and so on. It is really something which is new. And that's partly why they are also uncertain. Sometimes it's one thing, sometimes it's another, because they don't always know what they do. And that's one aspect of it. And I think that, clearly what is astonishing about Gaza is, as many people have pointed out, how so many people in the world, many people, even in India, which is semi-fascist already, with the government and so on, there is a strong sense of recognition as to what awful things are being done in Gaza. And in other places, even in Italy, there have been enormous demonstrations and so on, with this awful Meloni, who is the Ruda, is a quasi-fascist herself, and the same with England and so on. There are lots of demonstrations at the same time as this awful man Starmer, such a shit, really, such an inferior person he is also. He really is an inferior person. I mean, inferior in all sorts of ways. He's a slimy man who was also stabbing poor Corbyn in the back and things like that, who helped him up in that position. Anyway, that is there is a reaction on the part of people, ordinary people, but not of the politicians, because they think they are in a field which is responsible, and so they have to do all sorts of things in that position. And I think that there was a kind of recognition with regard to liberalism, which is what you were asking specifically about, which also allowed similar things now that you have responsibilities. I mean, as have cited, this is in the main manuscript that I'm working on rather than in the paper and so on. So, famous statement by Tony Blair when he was Prime Minister in England, said, well, you have to sometimes keep certain facts and not tell the whole truth, because otherwise it can be used by the media as a weapon against you. In other words, you can tell a lie by omission, because otherwise it will be used. Well, of course it will be used. This is what politics is about today. It's a struggle of that kind.
Except that the media is not eager to check power. Yeah.
Increasingly, because it's also owned by more and more conglomerates and so on.
So we want to close with a question about the universities.
Yeah.
The student protests in these past 15 months and the violent clampdown by the university administrations has further revealed, not that we didn't know about that, because we know about the origin of the university institution, especially in this country, but further revealed their complicity as well as the cowardice and silence of so many. So yourself as an academic, and someone has been teaching in this country also for a long time. Can you comment on how you see the future of academic institutions and the quote-unquote freedom of speech on campuses?
Well, I'm very depressed about that. Of course, as you like so many people, it seems to me that again the authorities in universities must be, I think, by a multiplicity of possible motives. Fear for their position, fear of losing funding, and at the same time, a sense of tremendous doing good to Jewish students who feel. This is what, as I said earlier on, this seems to me to be preposterous, using the notion of feeling as the basis of penalties and rules and so forth. But that's basically what it is. But no sense of feeling with regard to Palestinian students, for example, and even for Jewish students who belong to Jewish Voice for Peace and so on, who have been disenfranchised, say, in Colombia and various other places. There's no sense of that. But there's a sense that somehow they're doing good, because you see the Jews suffered so much, and we were really quite naughty for a long time, not allowing them to come here, and maybe we should try and make up for it towards it. These people are just inferior people anyway. One wouldn't use the word, but one would think that way. And the fact that one doesn't use that word, by the way, is itself a way in which the idea of inferiority can be again and again reinforced, because otherwise one would be a little too ashamed to say that openly, that these people are, even though they are students. And when they say things like, the students are creating disorder and so on and so forth, and then the business about why do they pick on Israel? This is anti-Semitic. This is unbelievable that people, and they believe it. And they, one very obvious thing is, I keep saying to people, because America is involved in it. Don't you understand? There are so many massacres. Why pick it? It's like saying to a woman, who she said finds somebody who's a harasser or something, a man to women, No, why doesn't she? She's dishonest because she should be condemning all harassment everywhere in the world. Therefore, don't listen to her. What is this nonsense? If she's the subject of harassment, that's what it is. Why the hell should she to be concerned about harassment? I mean, she could say verbally it's a bad thing. That's why I'm also objecting to it. But really, isn't it? I mean, why the hell? What is this? Why are they picking out? There are so many massacres in the world today. They are picking out Israel because Israel is an extension of the United States. The United States makes it possible. One doesn't have to be. One has to be an idiot not to recognize that everybody knows this. But somehow they justify it in some ways because that's the way in which they deceive themselves. It's this self-deception which is wonderful about them, and particularly with the development of notions of, and I think the questions of conscience and so on becomes much more important in modern life rather than a way of life. So you do something because you have a conscience which gives you a rule which says you shouldn't do it. Instead of you do something simply because there's no because. You do it because it's right. You learned, if you learned it in the way that you should learn it as a child, as we say that to children, right? And again, this is a Wittgenstein. You say it to a child. The mother says, don't eat this all by yourself. Give a little to your friend. Or don't pee on the carpet. It's too bad. All right, that's something which is dirty, but giving something to your friend is different. It's something that you should do, which is again. So the child slowly learns to make that discrimination, so that it should make this automatic, as part of the way it lives, part of its way of life, not as this following of a rule. Most of us, we do certain things because that's the way in which we live. And we assume that we don't follow a rule at all. And, sometimes we live badly, and sometimes we don't. But most of the things we do are done, if you like, out of a kind of training and a habit and so on. Wittgenstein says you have to train children like animals to begin with, so that they know how to distinguish these things. I used to have an American friend who was very worried about his child. He was also a student, a teacher and faculty member in the Sudan when I was there for a year. And he would say, his son, he can't, I tell him, don't fiddle with these books, and he will fiddle with some other part of the book. He can't generalize. He thinks I'm talking about that book only, and not about all books. So that's, it's so easy for people even when they're adults. So,
but anything about not just the administrations, because in a way, many of us, in a way, expected this position, but maybe not with this severity. But what about
all of these scholars and many of our colleagues who've been so disappointing in their complete lack of support?
I really am disappointed, and I don't know. Many of them won't sign letters, I know, because they make some excuse. They don't say, I'm worried about my position. But, they have some excuse. You've seen, both of you have seen this. So I think, again, all I can say is that even in more and more serious positions and situations, they are able to deceive themselves. And there are different ways in which they can deceive themselves, different excuses. As soon as they begin to see this and make excuses of a certain kind, then this is at play. Instead of saying, look, human beings are dying, don't you understand? They're not just dying. This is a newspaper, BBC sort of thing, and New York Review. They're not dying, they're being killed. They often say they are dying, but in fact they don't very rarely say that. And I think it becomes automatic. It's not because they're deliberately lying, it's because it becomes a part of their self-deception, that they can use one kind set of words and not another set of words.
When Palestinians are killed, they are dying, and when Israelis are killed, they're being killed.
Being killed, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean that sort of unintentional behavior. As hurtful and problematic as it is, we should recognize it as a function of repetition, as a function of exposure only to that language and that distinction.
Absolutely.
And that's why we need to speak out, because sometimes when you speak out, some people
will listen.
Pay attention. Not everybody will pay attention. Some people do it deliberately.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think, and that's why it is very important. It's even more important than actual simply going in a demonstration.
Yeah.
One should write, one should put one's name.
Absolutely.
And so on. Yes, absolutely.
Talal, we are so grateful for this. We kept you for quite some time.
No, I'm sorry I wandered all over the place.
On the
I
contrary,
kept forgetting where I started.
We actually, this is going to make for better, more natural conversation and actually listening. I would like to ask my partner, whom I learned a lot from, Sinan, if we could, at some point in the future, do this again.
I see. You think I will have more idea?
I am sure you do. We barely scratched the surface.
Yes, quite all right. We try to do that. And I keep trying to think about, and I'm doing this thing about ikhlaq fil Quran and so on. And it's already, I've decided it could be really a separate article altogether. So it's already about 20 pages. So it's long enough. I think, was it about 18? Anyway, so, because I also want to argue there at length in a way that I haven't at any particular moment against the notion of this is what I have against Iran. Not that it is an Islamic state, but that it is a state. Any state, whether it's Islamic or secular, is for me a danger. I don't think that a state structure can help but be, in fact, moving in a direction that is against any morality. It can't help it. It has to. For the sake of security, what is a state if it isn't for security? And it has to do that. And why nowadays, everything we do, phones, it's not only these poor people from Hezbollah, but others as well. I mean, we could, I think it was Mehdi Hassan at one stage. Somebody said to him something about, be careful of your page. Remember that?
On a panel, yes.
Yes, this Israeli. The world is an open oyster for these bastards. They're anything they say. Which is why I have so much respect for people like Ilan Pape and others like him, and Miko Peled and so on. Because they are themselves Israelis, but they are able to say this. They see it more clearly. And I think this is what I was very impressed by Miko Peled when his when his niece was killed. Instead of saying bastards, who are these people? Why are they so angry? And so he never had any Palestinian friends.
And his sister as well, she invited or accepted representatives of the Palestinians to attend the funeral, even though she was killed in a suicide.
Because she's written, of course, this book on the Palestinian propaganda in Israeli schools.
Israeli propaganda,
Israeli propaganda, about Palestinians.
Yeah.
I have a copy of that, which is good too. And
that's what's interesting about Palestinians and Palestinian narrative. They don't have to have propaganda.
No.
You just need cameras.
That's right. Yes, quite. This is what they had in this place in September. It was very little thing. What are they doing this? You have to keep reminding people of this, which everybody knows, but not very. The media will never highlight this. Was it 2018? The march, the Freedom March, or whatever it was called.
Yes.
Yep.
Which was a Pacific thing. They killed.
Slaughter.
They slaughtered. Oh, nobody mentions this. Nobody. I mean, the media.
Because history started on October 7th.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we will end on
Right, we will think
on February 2nd.
I see.
And
All right.
Talal, shukran.
Shukran
Jazilan.
Shukran lakum.
It's been an honor
for giving us your time.
Not at all. Well,
your wisdom.
I'm no wisdom. I'm so no, really. I'm so depressed. People keep saying, "Don't do that. Try and work on your own thing or read." I keep trying to read. These are all intended. Many of these, not all, but many of them are books I've already read. Some of them are very good. The one by this big fat one. You know that?
Robert Meister, After Evil, A Politics of Human Rights.
Very good. Have you read it?
No.
You should read it. Very good. Very good. Get a copy of it and read it. I want to reread it. I read it already, but I wanted to.
Here,
Yeah.
I will show it to the camera. Yeah.
Oh, I see.
If you can hold it up, that's great. After Evil. Thank you.
Yeah, because he talks about the rise of human rights since the beginning. I say from the end of the 19th century. He has a whole chapter virtually on each one of these, including this awful man. What was his name? Isaiah Berlin. I'm sorry, all these people are.
Relax.
What to do? No, I'm relaxed. This is the limit. This is the limit of what I can do. I can just call them shits, and I can call them dishonest bastards, and so on. But who will listen? They don't care. Anyway, but he has that, and a number of other people in this, which are very good, who were at the time the Cold War. This is roughly one of the major themes of the major theme of the book, and. He says that really since then, and the focus on the Soviet Union, which after all came into being as a result of the Russian Revolution, the Communist Revolution, right, with Lenin and so on, and that really displaced the development of these thinkers at the time of human rights. Displaced the notion of revolution, and with it the notion of creating a just society. That was what the Enlightenment wanted. That is to say, a just, with relationships which are just with people. Instead of which, and he's not against human rights, he thinks that they are important, but it was pain of the individual simply was the important thing. That must be stopped. And who can stop it? It becomes a duty also, as he points out. And therefore it is certain kinds of states only that can intervene on the grounds that they are preventing violations of human rights. So this has taken the place, he says, of what used to be a revolutionary perspective before of society as a whole and of working for a more just society. Instead of that now, it's preventing physical harm and physical pain and the duty to prevent that. And who but our favorite aunt, like the United States and Britain and France and Germany and so on, they are the only ones who can do this, of course.
Absolutely.
You know, who else can do it? You think that Egypt, even Egypt with bloody old Sisi, can go somewhere and say, stop this? He did say, you heard this, did you? الدم ما في دم على أيدينا.
Absolutely, yes.
What is this nonsense? Where did you get this idea from, that you have no blood on your hands? Well, that's the only thing he has.
Yeah.
You know, he's a very dishonest man.
Yes.
And he's put so many people in prison and so on. Which is why, really, I didn't want to go again to Egypt, because all my friends were left-wing, you know, and I feel that they were so delighted. I said, look, for God's sake, this was the Ikhwan, you may not, I don't have any friends from them, they were all left-wing. So I said, why not? This was the first decent election in nearly 50 years or whatever it was. So why not? And since the Ikhwan don't have a military wing, they don't have that kind of thing, why not organize for the next election?
Yep.
And make it, you know, even if some of them are behaving like you know, rascals and so on, but why not try and vote them out, in fact. But no, and it's not that the left in Egypt was important. I know that too. They're very small, but they gave it a certain legitimacy in the Western world and the Western media, which I thought was very foolish. And now, of course, then he went to the left. He did exactly to the left. Surprise, surprise. Why a surprise? You thought you would be safe from him? Why ever agree to or support a military coup?
Self-deception, as you said earlier.
I think so.
It explains.
Don't you?
Yeah.
I think so.
Very disappointing.
It must be so. What else could you shouldn't do that. You may disagree with completely or in 90% of what Ikhwan government will do, and then organize it. But the alternative is not necessarily the military coup.
No, of
How
course
could
not.
you support this? This is another great. The military coup. The military is the great. I've told you this already. No, that this is a great gift from European imperialism. No, seriously.
Yeah.
Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria. My friend Mustafa